Picture a classroom in the United States, anywhere from 1954 to today. The bell rings. 30 children stand up, place their hands over their hearts, and recite, "I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all." For most Americans, the phrase "under God" feels ancient. It feels like it was etched in stone by George Washington or Thomas Jefferson. It feels like the foundational definition of the American Republic, a nation intrinsically linked to the Christian deity. We often assume this link between Christianity and American patriotism and, specifically, the link between Christianity and free market capitalism is the natural historical state of affairs. To be a good Christian in America often implies being suspicious of big government and supportive of free enterprise. But what if I told you that this specific marriage of God and capitalism didn't start in 1776? What if I told you it was engineered in a boardroom in the 1940s? What if I told you that the phrase "under God" wasn't added to the pledge until 1954? And that the motto "In God We Trust" didn't appear on paper money until 1957? And most shockingly, what if I told you that this religious revival wasn't led by a prophet, but by the heads of General Motors, Sun Oil, and Hilton Hotels? That it was a deliberate, well-funded public relations campaign designed to destroy the New Deal, bust labor unions, and rebrand unregulated capitalism as a holy, Christian virtue? Today, we are uncovering the secret history of Christian libertarianism. We are going to find out how corporate America paid for a revival and how they convinced a nation that Jesus was the ultimate capitalist. To understand this invention, we have to look at the world before it happened. If you traveled back to America in the 1930s, during the Great Depression, the religious landscape looked radically different. The dominant theology wasn't free market, it was the social gospel. Leading Christian figures of the early 20th century, like William Jennings Bryan or the theologian Walter Rauschenbusch, argued that the Bible demanded social justice. They believed that unchecked capitalism was sinful greed. They argued that the government had a moral duty to help the poor, regulate corporations, and support labor unions. When Franklin D. Roosevelt, FDR, launched the New Deal creating Social Security, the minimum wage, and massive public works, he didn't frame it as socialism. He framed it as Christian charity. He quoted the Sermon on the Mount, and the American church, by and large, cheered him on. This was a nightmare for corporate America. Big business leaders, the heads of manufacturing, oil, and banking hated the New Deal. They saw it as government tyranny and a threat to their profits. But they had a PR problem. If they attacked the New Deal, they looked like greedy robber barons attacking the poor. They couldn't win the moral argument. They needed a new story. They needed to convince Americans that the New Deal wasn't Christian charity, but pagan statism. They needed to steal the Bible back from FDR. They needed a salesman. And they found the perfect one in Los Angeles. Enter the Reverend James W. Fifield. Fifield wasn't your typical pastor. He was the minister of the First Congregational Church of Los Angeles, a massive, wealthy church attended by the city's elite. He was charismatic, fiercely anti-government, and unapologetically pro-wealth. He famously said that reading the Bible convinced him that good Christians should be wealthy. In 1935, he founded an organization called Spiritual Mobilization. His goal was explicit: to save the freedom of the individual by uniting the clergy against the welfare state. He pitched this idea to America's richest men. He told them the ministers have the ear of the people. If we can convince the ministers that freedom means free enterprise, they will convince their congregations. The tycoons loved it. J. Howard Pugh's Sun Oil Sunoco wrote him a massive check. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce endorsed him. Leaders from General Motors, Chrysler, and Goodyear signed on. With this massive corporate funding, Fifield launched a propaganda blitz. He started a radio show. He hosted freedom contests for sermons. By the late 1940s, his monthly magazine, Faith and Freedom, was being sent for free to over 50,000 pastors across America, a third of all the clergy in the country. He didn't ask them to preach about taxes. He asked them to preach about spiritual freedom. Fifield and his corporate backers didn't just buy ads. They invented a new theology. They called it Christian Libertarianism. They had to fundamentally reinterpret the Bible to make it pro-capitalist. How did they do it? 1. Rebranding freedom. They argued that the freedom Jesus brought wasn't just freedom from sin, it was freedom from the state. Therefore, any government regulation that restricted a businessman's freedom was a restriction on God's gift. 2. The Ten Commandments. They focused heavily on thou shalt not steal. They argued that taxes were a form of theft. If the government taxes the rich to give to the poor, that violates the commandment. Therefore, the welfare state is unbiblical. 3. Individualism. They emphasized that salvation is strictly individual. God saves souls, not societies. Therefore, the social gospel idea of saving society through government programs was a heresy. It was pagan statism, putting the state in the place of God. This was a brilliant rhetorical flip. Before, supporting the poor, New Deal, was Christian. Now, supporting the poor via the state was idolatry. Before, unregulated capitalism was greed. Now, unregulated capitalism was liberty, the very structure God intended for human flourishing. By the early 1950s, this message had permeated American culture, but it needed a political vessel to make it official. It needed a president. In 1952, Dwight D. Eisenhower ran for president. Eisenhower wasn't particularly religious. He had never joined a church, but he was a savvy politician, and he was heavily advised by the legendary evangelist Billy Graham, who was also supported by these same corporate networks. Graham urged Eisenhower to embrace this new Christian nationalism. He told him that the Cold War against the Soviet Union wasn't just a military battle, it was a spiritual battle. It was God and freedom versus atheism and slavery. Eisenhower listened. After he was elected, he was baptized. He declared, "Our form of government has no sense unless it is founded in a deeply felt religious faith, and I don't care what it is." And then, the symbols changed. This is when the corporate campaign finally rewrote the national identity. The National Prayer Breakfast, 1953, organized by a corporate religious group called the Family, specifically to bring business leaders and politicians together under the banner of Jesus, under God, 1954, the Knights of Columbus and religious leaders lobbied to change the Pledge of Allegiance. On Flag Day, 1954, Eisenhower signed the bill, adding, "under God." He explicitly framed it as a weapon against the Soviets, reaffirming the transcendence of religious faith in America's heritage. "In God we trust," 1956-1957. This phrase had appeared on coins since the Civil War, but it wasn't the national motto. In 1956, Congress adopted "In God we trust" as the official US motto. In 1957, it began appearing on paper currency. Why put God on the dollar bill? It was the ultimate symbol of the movement's success. It physically merged God and money. It declared that the American economy itself was a sacred trust. By the end of the 1950s, the transformation was complete. The memory of the social gospel was erased. To be an American was to be religious. To be religious was to support freedom. And freedom meant free enterprise. The Christian nation had been invented, and corporate America had the receipt. So, when we hear politicians today talk about God-given liberty, to argue against environmental regulations or universal healthcare, we are hearing the echoes of James Fifield's PR campaign. This history explains a paradox that confuses the rest of the world. Why is the United States the only developed country where the most religious demographic is also the most opposed to social welfare and government aid? It's not because of the Bible, it's because of history. It's because for 70 years, American Christians have been catechized not just by the Gospels, but by a specific, corporate-funded theology that successfully fused the cross with the dollar sign. And this brings us to the final, provocative debate. On one side, was this movement a necessary defense of liberty? Did Fifield and his backers correctly identify that totalitarianism always starts by removing God and making the states supreme? Did they save America from sliding into socialism by reminding us that our rights come from a creator, not the government? On the other side, or was this the greatest spiritual heist in history? Did corporate America cynically hijack Christianity to protect its profit margins? Did they convince millions of believers to vote against their own economic interests by dressing up greed in the vestments of piety? Did they turn the Jesus of the poor into the Jesus of the boardroom? Is one nation under God a prayer or a sales pitch? Let me know your thoughts, respectfully, in the comments below. If you found this deep dive into the hidden history of American religion fascinating, please hit that like button and subscribe for more content that uncovers the stories behind our beliefs. Thanks for watching.